Prima di cominciare vorrei ringraziare l'Istituto Ellenico, la Scuola Grande di San Marco, l'Università di Steubenville negli Stati Uniti e poi il Comitato Scientifico. I, the least of priests, so says Marsilio Ficino, had two fathers. Ficino, the doctor, and Cosimo de Medici. From the former I was born, from the latter reborn. The former commended me to Galen as both a doctor and a Platonist. The latter consecrated me to the divine Plato, and both the one and the other alike dedicated Marsilio to a doctor. Galen, doctor of the body, Plato, doctor of soul. This is how Marsilio Ficino describes his twin vocation to his patron Lorenzo de Medici in the preface of his De Vita Libri Tres, or On the Three Books of Life. He's a doctor of body and of soul. At first glance, the references are fairly straightforward. Ficino is playing on Plato's analogies in the Gorgias, where, as everybody knows, Plato had said that just as medicine is to cooking with respect to the body, so is philosophy to rhetoric with respect to the soul. Therein lies Ficino's twin vocation, his birth as the son of Diotifeci Ficino from Filini Valdarno, the medical doctor of Cosimo de Medici, and his rebirth as the Platonic son of Cosimo. The first, his biological father, commended him to medicine under the guidance of Galen, the Platonic medical authority. The second, his spiritual father, commended him to philosophy, insofar as Cosimo tasked him with the translation of Plato and other late ancient Platonists. I'll return to this prefatory letter in a moment, but I'd like to step away from it for just an instant and speak about what Ficino calls his first birth as Marsilio, son of the physician Diotifeci from Filini Valdarno. Marsilio Ficino had two houses, a first home on Via Sant'Egidio in Florence, just around the corner from the Ospedale Santa Maria Nuova, where his father, Diotifeci, surely worked long hours. But in 1462, in order for Marsilio Ficino to have a tranquil space where he could complete his translations of Plato, Cosimo de Medici gifted to him this little villa in Careggi, fittingly near Florence's major research hospital now. Diotifeci educated his son Marsilio in the medical arts, and even though Ficino dedicated his life to philosophy, theology, humanistic scholarship, he still remained interested in medicine throughout his life. Marsilio Ficino's most famous contribution to conventional medicine was anything but conventional. In 1478-79, Florence was suffering from another episode of the plague, and Ficino cared for patients at his country estate in Careggi. Today's COVID pandemic has interrupted many scholars' carefully planned research projects, and this seems to have happened to Ficino, who took a pause from his Platonic philosophy to write a medical handbook, the Consiglio contro la Pestilentia, which was printed for the first time in 1481. It became a medical bestseller that was well read into the 18th century. To compose it, Ficino studied the most revered ancient and medieval medical authorities, but he also gives examples of different eyewitness accounts and experiments. For example, of cross-species contamination, where he witnesses the plague transferring from humans to pigs or from cats and dogs to humans. He also gives an example of asymptomatic contagion from patients in his care at Careggi. He says, for example, in these past days at our villa, a 2-year-old child was near someone infected of 7 years, and he often ate mouthfuls of food that the other had chewed for him. And the infection did not infect him, but others who remained farther away were infected. So just as doctors discuss about present-day pandemics, Ficino is concerned that children can be asymptomatic vectors to spread the disease. Some of his advice would still be very much recommended, not all of it, but some is practical and beneficial. For example, he recommends boiling water and using it to wash produce before eating it. He says to be careful not to eat meat that is about to go bad or any produce that could be spoiling. And he advises that one should wash one's hands, face, and body often, and gives recipes for how to make soap. Ficino also tries to curb the spread of misinformation about the plague. He says, for example, I also advise that every person be very careful when touching things that come from plague-infested areas, and not to eat anything from these areas unless they're cooked, cleaned, or washed. I almost want to pass over in silence the fact that some doctors often prescribed to drink during a fast the hot urine of a healthy young boy, or laundry detergent made of lye, and they prescribe this prepared remedy to rustic folks. So I think Ficino would have repeated this kind of advice in 2020 had he been alive, and if he had learned that some people were misled into thinking that they could cure COVID by consuming or injecting bleach. He encouraged his readers to avoid confined spaces, and when it was necessary for them to be in confined spaces, to try to ventilate them, to try to avoid crowds, and when possible, to escape from areas where there's a pandemic. Flee early, he says, far away and return late, because the virus remains active a long time and can harm more easily anyone who's not used to it. Ficino's plea to his readers to maintain social distancing was so important to his 15th century printer that he decided to put his advice in bold and capital letters. All sound counsel, even by today's medical standards. About 10 years later, Ficino published the second work of medicine, the 3 books on life, with which I began my lecture. Ficino's 3 books on life is a work of practical and theoretical medicine, devoted to helping scholars stay healthy and live long lives. But this description really doesn't capture all of Ficino's aims. It's much more than this. It's also the cornerstone of Renaissance theories of saturnine melancholy and genius, of many philosophical theories of theology, of astrology, of image theory, talismanic magic, music, prayer, just to name a few things in the book. It's a complex and fascinating work that was, like the more conventional Concilio contro la Pestilencia, a Renaissance bestseller, perhaps even more so. Between 1489 and 1647, it was printed in over 30 editions and translated from Latin into vernacular languages. Ficino initially wrote each volume of the 3 books on life separately. He finished the first book on how to live a healthy life, the De Vita Sana, by the end of 1480. He wrote the second book, actually third. He wrote the second book and last, the De Vita Longa, on how to live a long life, in August 1489. That is soon after having finished the second book that he wrote, which actually is the third book of the De Vita, called the De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, on obtaining or drawing down life from the heavens. So Paul Oscar Christeller first provided some textual evidence to try to confirm Ficino's claim that the third book originated as a commentary on Plotinus. I'll spare you a full review of the debates that followed in the wake of Francis Yates' thesis that the third book, the De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, isn't actually a commentary on Plotinus, nor a work of Platonism per se, since she believed that Ficino's claims were merely devious misdirection to hide the work's true nature, hermetic magic. However, based on clear evidence from Ficino's marginal annotations on Plotinus, I demonstrated elsewhere how key sections of the De Vita Coelitus Comparandus, the third book, does indeed originate in Ficino's interpretation of Plotinus. In short, it is by all accounts a work of Platonism that began with his reading of Plotinus, but a Plotinus whom Ficino reads through the interpretive lens of later traditions of Platonism, many of which specifically deal with theurgy, that is, the sacred rites and science by which the practitioner comes into contact or even translates himself into the divine. Therefore, many of Ficino's theories in the 3 books on life, especially the third book, the De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, or How to Draw Down Life from the Heavens, were based in important ways on late ancient theurgy, especially as formulated in the late 3rd century debate between Iamblichus and Porphyry, which came down in manuscript with the title Response of Master Abamon to the Letter of Porphyry to Anibo and the Solutions of the Difficulties Contained Therein, which Ficino thankfully gives a more simple title, the De Mysteris. It is this Platonic and theurgic medicine of the soul, Ficino's rebirth as a Platonic priest, which I will discuss for the remainder of my talk. I wish to read the first half or so of Ficino's preface to the 3 books on life, from which the first quotation I read to you today was taken. I'll interrupt my reading on occasion to give some commentary. And I've slightly changed Cask and Clark's translation on occasion when I see that it doesn't correspond to how I read the Latin. Ficino begins by invoking the myth of birth, death, and rebirth of Dionysus. I quote, "The poets sing that Bacchus, the supreme high priest of priests, was born twice, signifying perhaps either that one who's going to be a priest should be reborn at the moment of his initiation, or else that one is at length a perfected priest, his mind deeply drunken with God, seems now to have been reborn. Or perhaps in a less exalted sense, they mean that wine, the seed of Bacchus, is born on the vine, when the clusters are right beneath Phoebus and born again after the thunderbolt of the harvest rips them off the vine as pure wine in its proper vessel," meaning the thigh of Jupiter. Ficino offers 2 different interpretations, which we will see are actually not opposed to one another. The first, which I'll call theurgic, draws on Plato's Phaedrus, where Plato had spoken of Dionysus as the god responsible for the rites of the mysteries, the telestike. According to this interpretation, which I should add, Ficino thought he was drawing on an Orphic tradition, one should understand the myth of Dionysus's birth, death, and rebirth in Zeus's thigh as stages repeated in the priestly initiations into the mystery religions, whereby the priest, Ficino explains, had 2 rebirths. The first occurred during the initiation or the ordination of the priest, and once initiated, the second happened when the priest's mind was then transformed or perfected in a drunkenness that resulted from having come into contact with the god. The second interpretation, which I'll call a naturalistic or medicinal, is a humbler interpretation according to Ficino. In this version, Dionysus's first birth is the planting and growth of vineyards, whose vines grow under Apollo's sun. His ritualistic tearing apart, right, the sparagmos, should be understood as his grapes being torn off the vine during the harvest. And I can't think of a better time to be interpreting this myth than right now during the vendemmia season in Italy. The fermentation of the grapes in the barrel should correspond to the idea of sowing Dionysus into Zeus's thigh, which then, of course, is born again to give a second life to the fruit as wine. So let's continue with Ficino's text. "But our task is not at present to speak of sacred mysteries, when we are presently about to bring help to the sick by natural means, nor ought we to proceed in a style that expresses gravity after just beginning somehow or other with Father Liber, Dionysus that is, but rather in a style that is free and jocose. And rightly I say, somehow or other, for perhaps a more prudent author might have begun a work of medicine under the auspices of Phoebus, the first of doctors, rather than under those of Bacchus. But what if there might be a sign not without meaning in my mouth just now happening as I utter Bacchus? For he perhaps heals more salubriously with his nourishing wine and carefree jollity than that Phoebus with his herbs and songs. But whichever interpretation you accept, Bacchus, the leader of priests, is said to have had, as it were, 2 mothers. Melchizedek, moreover, that high priest, had scarcely one mother, scarcely one father." Ficino's exposition of the myth of Dionysus continues to pun with his Latin name, saying that it is more appropriate to speak about Father Liber, as Dionysus was known amongst Romans, in a free and playful style, in a stilo libero. Ficino proclaims ironically that it might have been more appropriate to invoke Apollo at the beginning of a work devoted to medicine, but in truth he thinks that Dionysus too has his own medicine, and not just medicinal wine, which Ficino, the doctor of bodies, often recommends, but a medicine of the particular kind which Ficino, doctor of souls, will discuss in the 3 books on life, which I will call theurgic. Ficino hints at these theurgic mysteries when he says, "But what if there might be a sign not without meaning in my mouth just now happening as I utter Bacchus?" In fact, in the 3 books on life, Ficino will theorize about the power of divine names. He explains that certain pronouncement hold their power as symbols based on the formal structure of the sound as a mathematized spirit, which connects the utterance by way of its mathematical ratio to the heavens. This ratio connects an analogy between the noetic structure of a divine name and the noetic structure of the intelligible to which it connects. They are, in the words of Iamblichus, symbola, or symbols, synthemata, connective tokens, and agalmata, divine images or even statues. Ficino has therefore entered into the world of theurgy, a word which, as Guido Giglioni has rightly observed, covers a semantic range that Ficino expresses with the linguistic fields of sacramentum and deificatio. It is, I think, precisely this terminology and this field in which Ficino is operating to discuss the more sacred Dionysian mysteries, on the one hand, in this preface, when he comments on Dionysian priests and their mysteries, and on the other, again in the preface, when he writes about how in these initiations priests either become divine like God, or identified with God or the God. Ficino ends this initial excursus into the meaning of the Dionysian myth by nodding towards another priestly story, namely that of the priest mentioned in Genesis, Melchizedek, who's often considered as a prototype of Christ and the Catholic priesthood, because Melchizedek gave wine and bread and a blessing to Abraham, which is, of course, often understood as a prefiguration of the most holy of Catholic mysteries, the sacrament of the Eucharist. Ficino's, in the proemium to the 3 books on life, Ficino has therefore silently introduced a parallel between the sacramental theurgy of Dionysus and the sacramental communion of Melchizedek, both of whom emerge in Ficino's interpretation as 2 mythical types of a single symbol of birth and rebirth. The more humble medicinal interpretation of the Dionysian myth as being about winemaking as a kind of medicine of life no longer seems humbler than the theurgic interpretation once one considers the sacramental nature of Dionysus's offering to humanity. Ficino's meaning is clear when one compares the descriptions of both figures. Dionysus is the supreme high priest of priests, and Melchizedek is the highest of priests. All of this needs to be taken into account if one wishes to understand the meaning of Ficino's famous account of his twin profession as being both doctor of body and souls, which comes immediately after the passage about Melchizedek. I won't read it for you again. Ficino is here describing himself in the same kind of symbolic typology. He too was born and then reborn to become a priest, albeit a humble one, signifying the combination of the theurgic and medicinal interpretations of the Dionysian myth. However, it is absolutely essential to note that Ficino doesn't actually speak here about his ordination as a Catholic priest in 1473, but of his rebirth as being consecrated to the divine Plato. Ficino's twin vocation as doctor of body and soul is his ordination and rebirth, as it were, as Platonic priest or theurgist. It might not surprise you to find out that Ficino and Giovanni Pico had nicknames for each other that resonate with the context of this preface. Pico went by Phoebus, and Ficino, unsurprisingly, went by Dionysus or Dionysius and Liber. I wish to make 2 final points about the preface to the 3 books on life. First, Ficino returns to his Dionysian wordplay by saying that he wrote the 3rd book of the De Vita, the famous De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, in this Dionysian mode. I quote, "So that from the very living body of the world, a more vigorous life might be propagated as if from a vine into her own body, which is in a way a part of the world's body." The allusion here is to the Neoplatonic interpretation of Dionysus's mythical tearing apart at the hands of the Titans, as representing the fragmentation of the singular world soul into a multiplicity of particular souls. Apollo's healing medicine, as his name implies, Apollon, or not many, is of course the unification of these dismembered limbs as a whole. Ficino is telling his readers that the theurgic medicine that he's offering them, how to draw life down from the heavens, is a way to learn how to find the Dionysian vine. And here he's playing between the word vine and life. To find the Dionysian vine, that is the life in our own body that connects us to the rest of the vineyard, the world soul. Second, Ficino continues the poetic interpretation of the myth by describing his 3 books, with another play on the word on Bacchus's name, Liber Pater, and the Platonic image of books as children, or in Latin, Liber Libri for books, and Liber Liberi for children. Ficino describes the reunification of his 3 separate books into a single volume, the 3 books on life, as a healing power collecting their scattered limbs and breathing new life into them. Ficino says, echoing the sacramental words pronounced by the priests to consecrate the Eucharist, this work of natural science, this my body, so to speak, cannot receive any life but mine, but such life depends entirely on my soul, right? Hoc opus physicum, id quasi corpus meum, or hoc est corpus meum. Ficino restages the performance in a letter 3 years later that was unprinted, but was the dedicatory letter to Lorenzo de' Medici's son, then Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici and future Pope Leo X, for Ficino's translation and commentaries on Pseudo-Dionysius's Theologia Mystica and the De Divinis Nominibus. And here I'm quoting Michael Allen's translation, which I slightly modify too. Since my genius had destined me ever to interpret the Platonists, and I have dedicated to my patrons, the great Medici, all the works of the Platonists up to now, and since the others have gone to and are going to your elders and brothers, those that especially pertain to theology and are therefore deemed sacred, the sacred high priest himself, in truth and in justice, seems to have claimed for you. Ficino's language of Dionysian theurgy is remarkable here. In his preface to the 3 books on life, he had called Dionysus, the god, the supreme high priest of priests, and he's now calling Cardinal Giovanni sacred high priests with the same terminology. And let's not forget that Ficino himself was called priest and Dionysus in Liber. Ficino then reveals the Iamblichian dimension to his Platonic priesthood, and I continue the dedicatory letter. Accordingly, I sent you a while ago Iamblicus, the Platonic priest, treating of the sacred mysteries of the Egyptians. After these books, I betook myself to interpret for you Dionysius the Areopagite, the Platonic and Christian theologian. It was my intention to dedicate the most eminent priest of the Athenians to you, the highest priests of the Florentines. Ficino had indeed dedicated his edition of Iamblicus de Mysteris to Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici in 1489. In that dedicatory letter, in which Ficino congratulates Giovanni for being elevated to the position of cardinal when he was only 13 years old, Ficino had called Iamblicus divine and a great priest, and playfully says that he sent Iamblicus to salute and congratulate another great priest on receiving his cardinal hat. Ficino is therefore composing the dedicatory letter to Lorenzo de' Medici for the 3 books on life around the same time as he was dedicating his edition of Iamblicus de Mysteris to his son Giovanni, probably about the period of Vendemmia in 1489, appropriately enough to speak about Dionysus. Ficino continues to play the game in his dedication of his edition of Pseudo-Dionysius to Giovanni 3 years later in 1492. He makes the same parallels between Dionysus, the god who oversees theurgic rites, the divine Iamblicus, the great Platonic priest, as well as Giovanni, the Florentine cardinal and high priest of priests, and now the Athenian Dionysius, the Areopagite, the apostolic high priest of priests. I'll read it just a little more of this letter. But since in early days, a stomach illness prevented me from hastening to conclude the work, and Dionysus's imminent arrival to you was delayed. In the meantime, inspired, I think, by Dionysus, you gave me a most exquisite gift of your father Liber. This liberated me from my languor and reawoke my drowsing Dionysus with your rousing Dionysus. Yesterday at last, and as I was about to put the final touches to this work, by some instinct, I know not what, I was drawn into the innermost recesses of your home and led to finish this work in yours in your bedroom. Thus, I never know when you're tempering the reigning star for me and I for you. So there before dinner, while still alone, I concluded this last clause of my commentary with this ending. God blazes out in a wonderful splendor to the mind that ardently loves him. You suddenly entered the bedroom and blazed upon me, so that this, your very own work, could be wholly finished under your own happy auspices. Apparently, Ficino missed the deadline to complete his edition of Pseudo-Dionysius because of a stomach ache. The teenage cardinal then offered Ficino some wine to help with his digestive issues, and he went to lie down in the cardinal's bedroom to get some rest. Instead of resting, however, he finished his commentary on the De Divinis Nominibus in this Dionysian inebriation. This is more than a subtle nod to the world of the three books on life, in which Ficino had indeed recommended wine as a cure for stomach aches. We recognize the same wordplay as we did before, and by offering Ficino wine, the Medici cardinal is now playing the part of the Dionysian archpriest, helping the Platonic priest perfect his mind to be reborn in Dionysian intoxication. Only in this mental state, Ficino explains, was he able to put the finishing touches on his edition of Pseudo-Dionysus. So how should we understand these Platonic games of Dionysian priestcraft? Well, I think the preface to the same edition of Pseudo-Dionysus can help us. There, Ficino says, the ancient theologians and the Platonists believe that the spirit of the god Dionysus dwells in ecstasy, the ecstatic departure of separated minds, when partly out of inborn love and partly with the god prompting them, they have surpassed the natural limits of understanding and are wondrously transformed into the beloved God. Wondrously transformed into the beloved God. This is theurgy as deification. Through theurgic rites, the priest transforms himself into the God, Dionysus. Ficino also seems to be conveying a subtext of the Mass here, when the priest performs the sacraments in persona Christi. This is my body, etc. Ficino's theurgic medicine transforms the souls. It deifies it. I continue the preface. Then with this new draught of nectar and with unconscionable joy, they reel as though they were intoxicated bacchantes. With this Dionysian wine, therefore, our inebriated Dionysus runs riot everywhere. He pours forth enigmas, he signs in dithyrambs, hence, as taxing as it is to penetrate with the understanding the profound meanings of our Dionysus, so is it equally difficult to penetrate the marvelous texture of his words, and to imitate the Orphic manner, as it were, of his speaking, and especially to render it into Latin. Ficino has just described the first Christian theologian, the apostolic Dionysius the Areopagite, as having been transformed by the god of wine's medicine into one of his many followers, the intoxicated bacchantes who sing mysterious Orphic songs and revel in the divine procession in the god's train. Melchizedek, Dionysus, Iamblichus, Ficino, and the Medici cardinal all become priestly avatars of the god Dionysus. I've demonstrated elsewhere that Ficino was very much aware, from Iamblichus's De Mysteris, that much of the Hermetic texts, the Hermetica, were pseudonymous, or much of it was pseudonymous. As Iamblichus explains, Egyptian priests used to ascribe their writings to the god who inspired them, Hermes. And Ficino is also aware that Iamblichus and Porphyry too adopted Egyptian priestly names and personae. As the title of their exchanges indicate, the responses of Master Abamon to the letter Porphyry to Anebo. A manuscript scholion that Ficino studies explains that these late ancient Platonists were employing Egyptian pseudonyms. Ficino certainly took on the name and persona of Dionysus. We've already seen that tonight. And it might very well be that Ficino was thinking of the apostolic pillar of the church, Dionysus the Areopagite, also known as Saint Denis in similar terms, as an Athenian Platonist theurgist who took on the name of the god who inspired him. After all, there is only one iota of difference between Dionysus and Dionysus. Thank you.